So I wanted to make a video about Chodesh Tishrei, the whole order of the whole month, according to Pnimius. And I'll explain what every one of these words mean. Since most of my public classes now tend to be more text-based and more the intellectual, theoretical way of understanding things, I feel like it's important to present also the more internal, when people say experiential, in any case, more based on the language of Pnimius, of Kabbalah, of Hasidus, and in an actionable way. So this is going to be not off the cuff, because nothing about Yom Nerim is off the cuff, but not based on reading something, but based on trying to give an overview, trying to give an overall picture of what this is all about, both for people that don't know and for people that do know, to try to get us into it. I feel like this is something I need to do right now. So the most general point, the most important and most first point is how the Zohar in Parshas Pinchas, I think, discusses, there's a discussion between the Chachmei Zohar, between the characters of the Zohar, internal to the Zohar. What is the order? What is the order of these days? It's called Sidura Dahani Yoimin, the order of the whole structure. From Rosh Hashanah, if you want, you can go earlier to Chodesh Elul, but Midiraisa, Ekra Din, Minatayre, we have from Rosh Hashanah until Shmini Atzeres, Simchas Torah. What is the story of this whole month? The 7th month, Chodesh Hashvi. It seems to be one story. There seems to be one process going on in it, and that seems like Al Pi Pshat. If you read like the simple meaning of things, they don't seem to have much connection. Although, of course, in everything, most simple pshat is always connected to the most simple, in the sense of without parts, right? The most simple secret. So if you'll read people that actually study like pshat in the sense of what the Chumash actually says, or what it means in the most basic sense, you'll see things that are very much connected to this. But in the simple level of pshat, in other words, the pshat that people generally teach, which is not really simple, because it has many parts. There's Rosh Hashanah and Aseres Tshuva, where we do tshuva. There's Rosh Hashanah as one thing, maybe connected to Yom Kippur, but Yom Kippur has another thing going on, which is the whole Slicha thing, the whole atonement of sins, the whole story of the Avodas Yom Kippurim in the Beis HaMikdash, and all the things that they did there, as we study in Masechtas Yoma. Then we have Sukkot, which is a happy time. It's the major holiday, Chag Hashem. And all these things are separate things. So if you think of like the way, and not now thinking of the theory of how to explain it, but more of the way it's done, the way it's experienced. If you go in places who teach Judaism in the sense of Pshat, in the sense of Musar, in the sense of Isaris, they'll see Rosh Hashanah one thing and Teres Metshuva another thing, or maybe the same thing, but at least the two major things, Rosh Hashanah and Sukkah, as being totally disconnected things. So this month becomes a very disjointed month, becomes a very much ununified month. Now, according to Pnimius, according to the Sod, this can't be that way. Firstly, because everyone knows that the search for real meaning, the search for what can be called, what we even call level of secret, level of Sod, it's just the search for more unity. Every level of meaning is level of coherence or level of unity. Like we call someone crazy, when he doesn't have a consistent or coherent sense of himself, or a consistent sense of how he acts in the world, all different kinds of breakdowns of humans, breakdown of the human soul, in psychosis or in schizophrenia, and all kinds of different ways in neurosis, all of these different ways to go wrong, they're all ways of losing coherence, of losing consistency, of losing, in other words, of losing unity, right? When you don't know who you are, when you don't know how you fit into the greater story, how you fit into your surroundings, how what we call what is real, what is not real, what is internal, what is external, how all these things fit together in one world, that's when you're basically not a person, right? You lose your personality. And not being a person means not existing for human beings. And this is really what people mean when they talk in general about a crisis of meaning, about losing meaning. Or in general, whenever anyone talks about a crisis, personal crisis or more universal crisis, it always means the falling apart, the coming together of the different ends. The coming apart of different areas, of different aspects of the universe. Both of the personal universe, when you're an eternal model of the universe. That's why if people have crisis of faith or crisis of family, crisis of partnerships, people say the world is falling apart. And the world is literally falling apart. In other words, the parts in it are losing their way of talking to each other, the way of existing as a single whole. And that's not a way for a human to live. Because human beings are the ones, and maybe not only human beings, but human beings do this consciously or intellectually. Ones that need to notice. In order to function, we need to have a coherent theory of the world. We need to have a coherent picture, a model of the world in our mind, in our self, really. Like even the most basic cause and effect, right? We grow up and we learn this model, this object permanence and cause and effect. And like I expect that if I move my hand will be moved. And if I push the table will push. And I expect certain things about the table. If it's heavy, it can't be moved. And if it's light, it will be moved easily, and so on. And if I'll find myself in a universe where all these expectations are negated, where suddenly I want to move my hand and it doesn't move, or it moves the other direction in which I've ordered it to move, so to speak, or if I'll suddenly be able to walk in the air and not be able to walk on the ground, you can imagine that's a horror movie. That's horror. That's horror. That's the world of horror. That's what makes people crazy. And that's why we're all somewhat crazy, because we don't have a coherent picture of the universe. The great predicament of people these days, and they probably forever, is that we have all these different personalities in ourselves and all these different parts of the world. People have ideas of science and religion being different spheres of reality, or you have more personally, you have your family life, and you have your work life, and you have your community life, and you have your inner life, you have your prayer life, and all these things don't talk to each other, or there's not even a way in which you think they can talk to each other, not even a possibility of them talking to each other. And sometimes we even think that the way they can both exist is by not talking to each other. Like we have this peace treaty in modern religious people, modern spiritual people in general, have this sort of no man's land peace treaty. It's not really a peace treaty. It's more like how do you call it? More like a ceasefire, where we agree not to encroach on each other's territories. We know that there's some truth in transcendent truths. We know there's some truth in the non-transcendent or the immanent or the directly experienced truth of the material world. And we don't have any way of bridging these things. Not only don't we have a way, we've explicitly went and burnt all those bridges for good and bad reasons. And now we're all crazy. And this is why everything we call Avodas Hashem, worship of the divine, or maybe divine worship. Not only the worship is of the divine, but it's divine worship or divine practice, doing divine things in the world, doing divine things in our life, right? Theurgy, a Greek way of saying divine action, right? God's action, or acting with God, or God acting in you, or acting on God, whatever direction you say it. It's action that is meaningful in the world of the gods, in the world of God. And since we don't really believe that our action has anything to do with God, we might be able to refer actions to God, maybe be able to intend. People have different formulations, but nobody really has an idea of how human actions can be divine, or how divine actions can be human. The great question of metaphysics and divine science. So we're all crazy. So that's why, for example, if someone tells you that he spoke to God, which is what supposedly religious people do all day, or once a week, or 3 times a day, and we tell stories about God judging the world on Rosh Hashanah and forgiving you on Yom Kippur and being happy with you on Psychosis. And if someone really believes those stories, we think they're crazy. And they are. Because for most of the time, crazy is just another word for not integrated, right? For not whole, for not connected, not having all the parts connected. And in general, we have made it work for ourselves as modern people entirely by disconnecting, by seriously and sharply and deeply disconnecting the divine world from the human world. And we're very sure that we act only in the human world. Maybe there's a divine beyond that will give reward and punishment, or maybe there's some point in referring and sort of intending the world beyond the divine existence. But it definitely doesn't mix into this world. In other words, miracles don't exist. Prophecy doesn't exist. Real providence doesn't exist. And all these things have very fine and kosher formulations. It's not that this is some kind of heresy. This is the standard Orthodox belief. It doesn't really exist, right? And so to the extent that we do feel ourselves obligated or committed to working with divine ways, to telling these stories, to living in these stories, to singing these poems, we either do it in a very neurotic way. In other words, since there's no feedback, and if anyone gets any feedback, they're crazy, right? And they probably actually are crazy. And there's never any way to know that you've done it right. In other words, there's never any way to know that you've done it. This is the most basic sense of being crazy. You're being gaslit by the universe when you pray and you don't get answered. And then people give you all these theories. Well, it's God saying no. Well, that's called gaslighting. God, if I asked for something, I didn't get it. I didn't even get a no. Getting a no would be some kind of sign or some kind of way of knowing what's the no and what's the yes. But if we're living in a world and we're doing things that have no meaning, having no meaning is just another way of saying we can't predict their cause and effect, their causal relation with anything else, right? We have these religious activities, we call them mitzvahs, or Avodas Hashem, worship of God, divine worship, and they connect with nothing, right? You pray to God, and God never answers. And there's never even an expectation. If someone really, really has an expectation of being answered, he's probably nuts. And there's a good reason that we think he's nuts, because, like, seriously. And this leads to 2 different responses. There's the neurotic response and the psychotic response. And both of them are very bad. They're just different sides of the same disconnect. There's different sides of the same tear that happened between heaven and earth. which we can't bridge anymore because we lost Yaakov Avinu's dream of the ladder, of the angels that lead us from one to the other. The neurotic one is the standard Orthodox one, or the standard Litvish one, where you're working within this divide, and you keep on doing actions which you don't really have any way of knowing if they're true. By definition, you don't believe you have any way of knowing if they work. An action that doesn't work is not even considered human action, right? This is crazy action, crazy people that do things, or it's some kind of like OCD, obsessive rituals, where you're ritualizing your inability to affect the world, right? That's what happens with powerless people in many ways, like the famous cargo cult. When you're powerless and you don't feel any way, which this is another way of saying crazy, another way of saying disenchanted, another way of saying disconnected from the world. When you're powerless and you have no way to affect. So you start enacting things in the neurotic way. You start enacting things which you think maybe this time will work. Or maybe I did something wrong. Maybe there's something wrong with me. This is why my actions don't work, because you've been gaslit. So you're never yotze, right? You never feel like you've done it. You're never happy. So you're in this endless Sisyphean chase. And this is why people sort of find solace, or sort of grasp onto halacha and grasp onto doing the things in the right way. Like, maybe if I'll be 100% sure that I blew the shofar according to every shita, maybe I could at least convince myself that I've done my part at least. Okay, and if God never answered, then that's maybe his problem, but at least I've done my part. But you never really know that, because there's no one to tell you that. There's no God. In other words, there's no connection to God. There's no way of him answering back. And you've deliberately shut the door on that happening. So you're neurotic. So that's the neurotic version, or the neurotic side of it. The other side is the psychotic side, where because you've been gaslit by the universe, because you've been disconnected, because your power, your actions, especially your divine actions, and I'll get in a minute to define better what I call divine actions, don't work. So you try to convince yourself that they do work. So the neurotic one is where you acknowledge, where you're living in the disconnect and you know that it doesn't work, and therefore you're just living under this judgment, under this Kafka's trial, where you don't even know what you're on trial for, and there's no way of being absolved of what you're accused of, because the accusation doesn't even exist. You've never even given the indictment to read. Or you live in some kind of fantasy world, and you create yourself, and this is sometimes in the same patterns of action, the same ways of doing them. But instead of thinking that you're never worked, that it never works, that it never affects anything, you start becoming psychotic. You start imagining that it affects. And of course, it doesn't actually affect anything in the world, so you replace the external world with internal world, or with internal imaginings, or with dreams, or with feelings. And people are infinitely convincible. The human soul is almost infinitely pervious to telling itself and believing itself to live in whichever world it wants. And of course it's hard, because reality is the kind of thing that likes to bump you in the nose all the time. So you got to work very hard. And this is why, in some sense, we have this one kind of tzaddik who's always neurotic, and the other kind of tzaddik is like the, Hasidic kind of klipa, or the Hasidic, Kabbalistic kind of thing, where he's never in this world, where he's always psychotic, where he's always believing that he's doing things. In other words, one person says the Messiah will never come. We only believe that he will come, right? Famously. And the other one says the Messiah came already. You need to open your eyes, you need to brush your buttons, whatever it is. But in other words, his effort becomes the effort of enacting for himself, since he can't actually enact it in the world, so he enacts it in inner worlds, or he enacts it symbolically and starts to pretend that his symbols are instead of the real thing, instead of symbolic action is very important, but instead of the symbolic action being a way of affecting the real world, it becomes a way of affecting itself. So you start living in this simulacra, and this simulation of simulation, and this image of an image. And those kind of people sometimes very impressive, because it's very impressive to build yourself an entire fantasy world and then go live in it. And it might be an important thing to do, just like the doing a lot of things and that are adequate might be an important thing to do. But these are both not solutions. These are both just different enactments of the lost ladder. And another way of saying it is that both of these signs don't have a unified theory of themselves, don't have a unified theory of the world, don't have a unified theory of history. Or we could say one definitely doesn't have a unified, it's just a long list, an infinite shopping list, an infinite to-do list of things you need to do and you need to buy. You need to make sure to have fish in the water for Tashlich, and the kosher esrog for Sukkos, and the lulav that doesn't have any split on the top, and the shofar with all kind of sounds. And there are a bunch of disconnected things that don't have anything connecting them into one. Or you're sort of in the fantasy of oneness, but it's not real oneness because it doesn't really take into account everything that disagrees with it. It's just closing its eyes to everything that disagrees with it. Or pretending, working with their symbols or their images instead of with the thing itself. So this is our predicament. This is where we find ourselves. Now there's one middle way, going back to what I was discussing about the pshat, different senses of pshat. The middle way, which was accepted by, could probably say most Rishonim, and is, according to every solution, has to be the primary and first place where you can at least measure something. In other words, you can at least stay sane. And that's the focus or the center of the person, the center of the human being. Not the center of the person's experience, not the center of the person's internal feelings, because that's a part of a person. It's a very important part, but it's a part. But the center of the entire person. And then, this is the first step only, but at least, if you want these things we call Avodat Hashem to work, you want them to not be insane. You firstly see them as things that are supposed to work on the person or on the world of people. So we say things like the shofar is meant to arouse you from sleep and to arouse the community from sleep. Or you say things like lulav is meant to make you happy or to remind you to be happy. And these are things we know what they are. We know what it means to be asleep. It means not noticing what's important in life, not being centered around those things. We know what it means to not be happy. We know what it means to do specific actions to affect happiness or to affect communal happiness, a communal celebration. These are all basic things that we know what they are. And then we reorganize our understanding of the tradition, reorganize our understanding of all these rituals, of all these things, of all these stories, as ways of affecting the human world. And this can be measured. In other words, if you see that you were not aroused, you're not awakened by the shofar, that means that you didn't do it. There was an action with no meaning. And actions with no meaning are not human actions. So there was no human blowing the shofar. So that didn't happen. And there's no way out of this. This has to be the first step at least. In other words, so we're thinking of the level of pshat. Pshat in the sense of the musar, the so-called rationalist directions which the Rishonim took. You have to keep it sane. You have to keep it real by understanding it as affecting you. And you, not in the sense, like I said, not in the internal sense, but you in the full person sense, in the person that acts in the world sense. And here people get very stuck in the same neurotic and psychotic directions because they get stuck with the law and they get stuck with the rigidity of the law. And people start saying, well, like Rambam himself said, these are just maybe reasons or tamia mitzvahs, but they don't exhaust everything the mitzvah is. There is still some sense of just following the law, or just doing your obligation. But that's crazy. Doing your obligation without having any effect is just a kind of sickness called neurosis. Or you could go and say, well, you've got to believe that it has an effect, and that's the same psychosis. And this is why the people in this way have very explicitly said that if you haven't done anything, if it doesn't do anything, then it hasn't been done at all. And you can't get into all these stories of, well, legally you did it, but you didn't really do it. Well, then that's a legal fiction. Do you want to live your life in a legal fiction? That's another sort of psychosis. You need to try to be healthy people. But these weaknesses are inherent in the way in which this puzzle building exercise has been done. And we need to acknowledge that. And we need to try to do that in a healthy way also. The other big weakness, or one weakness in this sort of system, is that it's not entirely true. In other words, like we mentioned from Rambam himself and others, there's always this excess. There's always something in the inheritance of the law, in the inheritance of the tradition, that's going to go beyond what we make of it. And we really need to think about this honestly. And some people can honestly say, yes, those are things that exist as some kind of relics, as some kind of vestigial organs. And their meaning is in their history. Their meaning is not in their performance in the here and now. And if you're happy with that, then at least you're sane still. And I think you'll also have to be happy with history running its course over them, right? So if you think, well, we have this ram's horn thing because at some point, whatever the history of this is supposed to be, and it stayed that way because people like being conservative, especially religious people, they're averse to change, but people in general are averse to change. And it stayed that way, but it's really, for me, in other words, the practice, the live practice, is just this awakening from slumber, this awakening from sleep. And in general, if I'm already awake, then yeah, it's less meaningful, it's less strongly true for me. And the way in it's done and all of the details are just history, is their meaning. And the fact that we have this hodgepodge of things is because we're coming from a long history, and each generation and each location added its different addition, and it's much easier in traditional societies to add things than to delete things. So we end up with a long list of incoherent, inconsistent practices. And to the extent that this is the reality, it's the reality, and denying it is not going to solve anything. But what to do with it is the live question. Now, as I've said, there are people, and this might be a way, I don't see it working very well for various reasons. as long as you can accept, and again, understanding the meaning of something being what it does in the world, where it comes from, where it goes, right? What is its place in this cause-effect network of the universe? And if you understand the precise things, the precise rituals that you're doing as just being part of that long chain of cause and effects, which includes all of history and includes all kinds of weirdly literalist people and weirdly stubborn people who won't change their kind of hat, although it doesn't make sense anymore, then you're still sane, at least. I really want to get to solve this correctly, but then at least you're still sane, because you haven't replaced reality either by like striving towards something impossible or by just wholesale replacing it in your mind. But I think that all of this is not enough, because it's not really the way in which people do things. Nobody really picks up the shofar because his ancestor is something. People do that for like a generation or two, and they're called cultural traditions, and they stop doing it. Which is another way of saying that this can only exist as the last 3-4 links in a causal chain, which means it doesn't have much power, right? It can't perpetuate itself very much, which is another way of showing the weakness of it has less meaning or has less connection to the rest of the world. So it seems to have worked better, historically have worked better, and needs to be understood very correctly, is what we call in general the Kabbalistic approach. And we need to be very, very careful not to identify this with the psychotic approach, because it's not the same thing, although it many times is. And the approach that I see the Mekabalim doing, and the more clearly and the more deliberately and the more daringly they do it, the more successful they are, is by not trying at all to give an account, an intellectual account, a sort of historical or textual-based account of why things are the way they are. They do this, and they pretend to do this, but that's the result of what they're doing, and not where they start. They might end somewhere very close to the original text, because the original text had sources too, had sources of meaning and causes too. And they might be the same. But the better way to connect to it is, instead of sort of doing this detective work throughout all the ins and outs of history, to go directly to the reasons human beings do things. And what people like the Arizal did, people like the Zohar did, was to just wake up and think what it is for a human being to be human and to be divine. And the reason they think that a human being is human and divine is not because there's a book that's full of these divine phrases or divine commands, right, called mitzvahs. Because those can be very easily, and they know that, right? There's no interpretive war where like, well, you must agree that this is the pshat, because otherwise how do you explain this and that passage in such and such book? I mean, people have played this game, and Mekabalim have not been out of this game. It's a very traditional game, and it's a human game, and it's a Jewish game. But that's not really what's moving them. And I think that anyone honest knows that every question has an answer, and every answer has a rebuttal, and the rebuttal to the rebuttal, and there's no winning that game. So you could, of course, easily say, well, who said that these things were supposed to be divine action? Maybe they were just supposed to affect us, like we just discussed, or maybe they're just relics of an ancient civilization, as they factually definitely are. But we have to start somewhere else. We have to start in the acknowledgement of the reality, of the full reality, what they, in their language, call of all the universes, all the worlds. We have to acknowledge this reality every day. In other words, if you wake up as a human being, you've woken up as a human being. You've woken up as a piece of matter affected by the laws of gravity and the laws of atoms and physics, all kinds of things like that. I have also woken up as a living being, as something affected by the nature or the laws of biology. Another whole level of things going on, right? You can't only act like a rock. You can't only understand yourself in terms of physics. Maybe according to reductionist thought you could, but can't actually do that as a human being who wants to understand, who wants to live as a human. You need to live that too. And you can't only understand yourself as a biological being. Again, although you might be able to do this reduction, you need to also understand yourself as a thinking being, as an intellectual being, as a conscious being. And you can't stop there either. You need to also acknowledge and understand yourself as a divine being. And this is just a word I've been using. But as a transcendent being, as a being who has an interest, right? These all can be used, say words for interest. Like I have an interest in physics, or like the other guy said, physics is interested in me, right? I can't jump up to the sky, I'm gonna fall down. Gravity is interested in me, even if I'm not interested in it. That's what a real interest is, right? It goes both ways. It's not disconnected, it's not neurotic or psychotic. It's integrated. I can jump up and expect gravity to pull me back down, and I have a very good, healthy relationship with the earth, with gravity. I can eat and expect, if I'm healthy, my body to digest it and to make me work as a biological, as a living animal. Of course, I can do all these things badly, but I can do them. And I could think, and I can expect the world, the universe to respond in intellectual ways, right? We only have science, we only have every kind of science ever because of human beings speaking to the universe in intellectual language and the universe speaking back, right? We can formulate the world in math, we could formulate the world in concepts. Whether all these things, the extent to which they're real or externally real is sort of another way of being psychotic or neurotic. Because anything that you speak and it responds, you act and it responds, I jump and I fall back down, that's real. That's as real as things get. And me eating and the food becoming me, or me acting in all kinds of ways as animals act, and me having children, whatever animals do, that works. That's what there is. In the same exact way, me intellectualizing, me understanding, me conceptualizing myself, or situating myself in the universe as an intellectual being. In other words, as someone with intellectual aspects of the world, right? The mind, the way in which the world is somewhat rationally ordered, at least in some sense, maybe not entirely, works. I can work with that, right? I can plan my day based on that. I can open my phone's GPS, who's based on some kind of fancy math, and it tells me where to go. That's called living as an intellectual being. And you can't deny that without being crazy. Different kinds of crazy. And in the same way, you can't deny the order, or maybe you could call it the non-order, that transcends that order, the intellectual order. And this is the thing where, since it's supposed to be the cause of intellectual order, maybe you could say the oneness itself, the thing that makes all these things together coherent in some kind of way, right? At least for a human being, my physics and my biology and my mind and my consciousness and my God work in the same world, work in the same way. It's one that leads to the other and the other leads to the next. There needs to be some cause for this entire harmony. There needs to be something that this harmony is. I'd use the word cause. You should not think of it in a way where you usually think of it. There needs to be something that this harmony actually is. And there needs to be something in which that harmony, or that it, we call this God, and people have called it different names, is with me, talks back to me in the same exact way as me planning my life according to reason works, me planning my life according to the divine works. And of course, you can't break any boundaries in general. Maybe there's magic ways. You can't do it in crazy ways. Right? You can't be psychotic. Psychosis is just another way of saying, like in other words, since in order to take a train, you need to know the map of the train. So just studying the map and thinking about it really hard will get me somewhere. No, you need to use the map in order to buy a ticket with your very not map kind of hands, or, well, now it's electronic, so it's very intellectual still. But you still need to pick yourself up and go there. And then your knowledge of where the train goes will help you. And in the same exact way, if you think prayer was a thing, prayer is another way of saying planning my life, planning my day, organizing my life around the principle of the principles. Right? If I'm a rational being, I plan my life around rational principles, all kinds of principles of cause and effect. And of course, cause and effect in human life is very complicated. We have the book of Job, who tries to worry if there's really a cause and effect in human life, otherwise known as reward and punishment, otherwise known as the problem of why bad things have to happen to good people. And that's a thing, right? Not always. You can do the best things and your life doesn't respond in the way it should. And that's a problem you have to deal with. Not only for justifying God, right? Justifying God is not a thing that's interesting enough as an intellectual practice, like some kind of, well, we're representatives of God and he has to win some debate club. This is not a debate club. Life is not a debate club. Debate club can be helpful for life. But we need to have a theodicy in order to be able to live our life and not be crazy. Right? You need to have some kind of understanding of how the good leads to good and the bad leads to God, or define the good and the bad by what it leads to. This is where it becomes even more scary and complicated. But there is some kind of cause and effect. There's some kind of ordering in human life. You plan your life in the correct way and you hope for the correct results. And it doesn't always work. Problem. But it doesn't mean that you should not plan your life. Nobody is going around saying, since some people win the lottery, nobody should go to work. Right? In the same way, nobody should go around saying, or it would be dumb to go around saying, since some very good people have bad things happen to them, you shouldn't try to be a good person. And there's different ways of formulating this, but I'm just trying to point at the basic thing, that this is just another instance of us trying to be sane, us trying to live in a world that has some kind of coherence or some kind of meaning. And these might be a limit to our understanding of it and our grasp of it, and we can get into all kinds of things like that. But that's the basic of being a normal human being, of being sane. And the important point here is that the divine is not something that comes to negate everything else or to contradict everything else. It's something that's supposed to, well, people have this nice, cool language for this, elevate everything else. It's what makes everything coherent to one thing. So prayer needs to be working in the same way that planning your day needs to be working, and in the same way as eating needs to be working for you to have a successful day, in the same way as just waking up and getting out of bed physically is the first step, and so on. And none of these steps can work without the other, right? You can have the best breakfast if you stay in bed, so you're like physically home. Well, again, you can do remote nowadays, but the point is the same point. You need to go to the work. You need to go to the world. And prayer works in the same way. If you have a good plan, then you could start enacting it. And if you have a good divine plan, then you can start enacting it in a divine way. And of course, just like the possibility of intellectually planning your life opens up possibilities that you would never have dreamed of. Well, dreaming is some kind of intellect already, or imagination. But if you're people that are depressed, right? If when you're depressed, that's a kind of, at least some kinds of depression, are just an instance of not being able to dream, right? Of not being able to project yourself forward, of not being able to imagine a different reality that you will create by your action, right? Being helpless. And very often when you're depressed, you're living in a biological way, right? So some people are so depressed they won't eat, but other people will just eat and sleep, or just sleep and not do anything else. So you're living on a biological level, happens. And then you don't get anything done. And if you're not depressed, so you're alive as a human, as an intellectual, rational being, then you create plans and you try it. Not all those plans work, but you try to get those plans work. And that's the only way they can work. And that opens you to worlds that can never happen from just being a biological being, like answering the demands of the body. And even if, by the way, even answering the demands of the psychological body, what's called people call their self. I mean, you could feel very good, maybe not, because you won't feel good if you don't do anything. But if you take some kind of drug, it just makes you feel good. You could answer all those needs without doing anything. But being a human is more than that. It's being also someone that has ways of planning to act in the world, using his mind, and does them. And that makes you a whole different person. And this is all just supposed to be an analogy, well, or the beginning to understand what it means to be a divine person. There's just as many possibilities that are possible, at least as many more possibilities that open up, or higher ways, what's called higher here, right? Broader ways of conceptualizing your life, of planning out your life, and having it hopefully work out in that way. If you pray and not only plan. So prayer is the higher instance of planning. I'm using planning as an analogy for prayer. And just like planning is taking into account the rationality of the world, right? You expect the world to act in certain ways and you plan based on that. So you're taking into account a higher level of order as then can be seen in just thinking of the physical level order. In the same way, praying is taking into account an even higher level order, which can be seen in praying or seen in divine action. And this means that it needs to be studied. Just like planning is you can't cargo cult planning. You can write up entire plans and business plans and action plans, and if you don't know how to do them, or if you're just playing around with very fancy plans and projects and PowerPoints and all kind of fancy ways of doing it, people get stuck in that. You can get stuck in prayer too. And then the prayer doesn't get answered. We're thinking of divine action as just the highest way of humans acting in the world, or acting in the world with what's beyond the world, with the source of life or the source of the world. And there are ways to do this. This is what Torah was supposed to be. This is what any kind of faith is supposed to be. This is what any kind of religion promising. Of course, there's a lot of faith and religion on all the levels we discussed before. But the real sense of it has to be only here. And what this means is, and I'll sort of jump over to a general conclusion. What this means is that these are orders that can be studied. And what this also means is that understanding the goal of these orders is what's going to give coherence and consistency to a lot of diverse things that seem to be inconsistent. And it might even, if you understand so-called divine plan, it might even give consistency, give coherence to everything accumulated through historical accident. Not in the sense of denying the accident. You see, so many people think, okay, so now what we're going to do is deny the historical accident way in which it came to us and say, okay, but there's like a deeper meaning. No? We're going to encompass that. We're going to explain, not by being psychotic again, not by thinking that every random thing is, of course, that's a very complicated thing to say what's a random thing. But not by giving meaning to every random thing. There needs to be things that are not meaningful, at least in every human section, maybe even in every divine order. There are things that are not meaningful. We can get to this. But at least we gain the ability to have many more things, many more diversely seeming things, cohere into one structure, cohere into one thing. This is why, for example, I'll give an example. For example, prose has seemingly more coherency than poetry. More coherence. But that's not correct. That's just because poetry is, hopefully, it's not entirely schizophrenic poetry, is operating in a higher register, right? It's singing to a different scale. If you think in the scale of prose, then you have to write an essay. It has to have an opening paragraph and a supporting paragraph and a closing paragraph and all kinds of rules and structures that people expect from a coherently reasoned or argued essay. But if you're doing poetry, then you might be just it might seem that you're working with the order of like the alliteration of the words or the rhyming or the all kind of different like seemingly artificial ways that poets use to set the beat for their words, right? You've got meters and but the reason poets do that even, of course, sometimes it's artificial and sometimes it's fake. But the real reason why it happens is because they feel that they're trying to express a coherence, a order that is not really susceptible to being explained in an essay. There's still a lot of coherence in it. There's still even more unity. It is the kind of unity that can be shown by these ways. And sometimes the fact that it uses accidental unities, like I'm going to write a poem by such and such meter with such and such amount of alliteration and rhyming and arbitrary constraints. And that's going to allow me in some way to express a sort of progression. Maybe it's a progression of feeling, maybe it's a progression of someone's life story, maybe it's an overview of the universe. It's going to allow me to express that much more clearly than I can do it by just giving it with words. And something similar should be said for what the Arizal would do for a poem called Chodesh Hashvi, a poem called Chodesh Tishrei. We blow the shofar and we fast on Yom Kippur and we make a sukkah and sukkahs and we dance with the Torah and Simchas Torah. And these are all various things who have accumulated in random historical ways. But if you think about a more basic order, a more fundamental order, then they could all express the one way of being, or some kind of progression, some kind of story of being that goes up and down and comes back and conflicts and resolves of human beings. And that's how we should do it, right? So we should not do it because our ancestors have done it. We should do it because these are expressions and ways in which the human being moves when he reminds himself that he's a human being. Yes, part of being a human being is being a being with a history and with a future and a past and a present. But all of these generations in history, they've all ultimately been moved by the basic ingredients of what it means to be a human, and when you include the divine in being a human. Therefore, what our work would be to explain, and this is not going to be in this video anymore, but what our work would be to explain is to show some kind of map. And this map might be, people will say, well, it's artificial. You're making like some kind of connection with things that were not there to begin with. But that's on the level of physics and of history. But when you say, and that's why one way of saying this would be to say that we're not interested at all in the historical why. We're interested in the present why. We're interested in how I can, and this would be a slightly bad way of saying it, but I'll say it for the clarity. We're interested in the way that I can use all of these things, all of these rituals, all of these actions, all of these stories, all of this history for the purpose of me being a human being. A human divine being, don't forget. And that was the daring that Arizal dared to do that and to explain things in these terms. And he dared to figure out a structure and to give words to these orders in which things are. And some of the specific ways that he's done it, some of the specific ways he's organized it, some of the specific ways he argues for it and connects it to different texts and to different words, is still somewhat accidental and still somewhat pertaining to his way. We don't have to follow his historical conditions, his psychological conditions. We have to learn from this. We have to learn from this to find the basic orders. In other words, the best way to understanding is to try to be a human being. And try to be a full human being without denying any part of it. Without trying to be only rational or only mystical or only feeling or only actional. Trying to be all of these things. All these things are human. And then you start to figure out the puzzle how, and it becomes there's a great redemption of the past, a great redemption of our history, and seeing, so now I see why people have done this. And maybe I'll see it and I'll do it myself in a different way. Or maybe I'll do it in the same way. But at least I'll have the internal map of things clear to me. And then I won't be doing 1,000 things, I'll be doing one thing. Being a human being. So that was a kind of preface. If we'll be able to, we'll do a continuation of this to give a sort of account of what is this one thing which we can see in the whole progression of this month. And it's an image or microcosm of many greater things, and which can be done every day in a lifetime or in a year or in a month or in a week. Okay, thank you.